Hi there, welcome to the latest installment of the Cafe Culture Northeast series. Cafe Culture is based in Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK. It's been running for about 15 years. This is the first series, as you can imagine, that is done by a digital platform, which has its advantages and disadvantages. One great advantage is that it's possible to get John Danaher, who's based in Ireland, in conversation with Brian D. Earp, who's based in Yale. So that this kind of opportunity to get people from different sides of the world in discussion is certainly a great advantage. Obviously, it's the election day today, so I'm not sure if human obsolescence in the workplace that John Danaher is going to be talking about has anything more to say about human obsolescence in a more general capacity. We shall see how the evening or the morning or the afternoon pans out. So just to introduce Brian D. Earp before he in turn introduces John Danaher. Brian is actually, amazingly enough, yet to finish his PhD, but despite this fact, he is a very widely published author. He's a philosopher and cognitive scientist based at both Yale and the UHERO Center for Practical Ethics at Oxford University. His co-authored first book was published at the end of last year. In America, it's called Love Drugs. In the UK, it's called Love is the Drug, published by Manchester University Press. And Brian is also a columnist for The Philosopher, which is one of the partners in the Cafe Culture Consortium. The new issue's just come out, so look it up online and maybe consider buying a copy. So the book we're going to be talking about is this one, which is an absolutely fascinating book at the intersection of ethics, technology, artificial intelligence, automation and utopia, human flourishing in a world without work, published last year by Harvard University Press. So I think I've said pretty much everything. In terms of the format for the evening or the event, I keep saying evening because it's evening for me, but obviously it's afternoon for Brian. Brian and John are going to be in conversation for around half an hour, at which point we'll hand over for audience questions and answers. Please send any questions you have for Brian and John to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. The chat function is something I'll be using to send any relevant information. Obviously, if you want to say a few things to each other, please use that. But for the questions, please use the Q&A and please keep them relatively short so that Brian can just fire them off when it comes to the Q&A part. So I'll hand over to Brian now, and I really hope you enjoy what follows.
Thanks. Okay. I see John. So, okay, looks like everything's working. I want to make two preliminary comments and then I'll dive into questions. They're both kind of forms of compliments to you, John. So I hope I'll butter you up and get you in a good state for my hard-hitting questions. So the first thing is, John has a podcast called Philosophical Disquisitions. I think your blog has the same name, doesn't it, John? They're both called that.
That's correct.
And I've had the pleasure of being a guest on John's podcast on 2 different occasions. And it's a really excellent format. Lots of interesting topics are discussed. And I guess my standard for this discussion is if I can ask questions with a fraction of the nuance and care and preparedness that you put into the interviews you hold for others, I'll feel like that was a total success. But this is just a plug for John's podcast, which you should definitely check out if you're not familiar with it. The other compliment I want to make is that one thing I like about your writing, John, is you'll often explore extremely controversial topics, and you'll sometimes lead the reader into what might seem like extreme or troubled territory, but you'll do it in a way that is calm and reasoned, and often leads the reader by the end of the discussion thinking, well, perhaps that idea isn't quite as absurd or shocking or bizarre as I initially thought it was. And that was an experience I had all throughout reading your book, where I'd come across a claim or an opening argument or a thesis statement of some kind. And my initial thought was, that just can't be right. That just doesn't seem like that's the way we should take this conversation. And then by the end of the chapter would come more around. So the general approach I'm going to do is basically, I've got some passages flagged here, which are the most superficially shocking in some respect, and I want to put you in the hot seat to try to see if you can lead us back into calm waters once I've confronted you with some of your own words here that may initially seem implausible. But before I get into all that, I was hoping you might say a few words just to introduce yourself to everybody. Who are you? What do you do? And maybe how did you get into writing this book?
Yeah, so my name is, as you said, John Danaher. It seems odd to repeat that. I am actually a lecturer in law. I teach in a law school in Ireland, at the National University of Ireland in Galway. It's a bit of a mouthful of a name. But I write and research mainly in the kind of philosophy of technology, ethics, philosophy more generally. I've written across a kind of a broad range of topics, and I cover a fairly broad range of topics on my blog, which you were kind enough to mention there as well. In terms of like how I started writing this book, I started writing about the kind of technological unemployment debate many years ago, probably back in sort of 2012. And there was a flurry of books that were written kind of post the 2008 crash, which were looking at the seemingly jobless nature of the recovery post 2008, and opining that if you combine this with the trends in automation and artificial intelligence, that this would lead to widespread unemployment. And a lot of the debate around that focused on what the implications of this would be for money, for people's income, the kind of negative distributional impact that this would have on income in society. And I felt like less people at that point in time were talking about the impacts that this would have on people's sense of meaning and purpose in life, since for better or worse, a lot of people derive a sense of meaning, a sense of self-worth from the work that they do, from the paid employment that they undertake. So if you take that away from them, what's left? Is it something that's better or worse? And so that's what I wanted to explore in this book.
Yeah. So I want to ask one more big picture question before getting into these specific passages. And this goes back to something Anthony mentioned, which is in the US right now, there's this election going on where I think a lot of people feel that a great deal is at stake. There's, a really active conversation about matters of racial injustice and structural problems that are affecting people right now. And in the book, you start with some material that's based around where we are right now. And you've just mentioned some of it. There's evidence all around us that people are having some of their jobs being, shipped over to robots. And so there's an aspect of your discussion that's very immediate, but you also get into really imagining the future in various possible worlds and ways it could go. And by the end, we're talking about virtual realities and we might become cyborgs and all of that. So I just want to know, how do you think of the value of these kinds of imaginative, futuristic projects in an environment where people might say, man, there's a bunch of shit going on right now. We should be focusing on, poverty, and we need to be focusing on racial justice and these kinds of things. How do you square these kinds of almost sci-fi projects with the immediacy of the political climate?
I suppose there are two things to be said. And one of them you kind of touched upon, which is that some people would argue that the concerns around technological unemployment and automation are very immediate and real concerns that you could put on the shelf alongside things like racial injustice and the coronavirus, whatever the kind of hot button topic of the day or the main pressing issue of the day is. In fact, there was a candidate for the US Democratic nomination, Andrew Yang, who built his entire campaign around this. And there are also people who have argued that Trump's election in 2016 was at least in part driven by kind of the impact of automation on manufacturing in the Rust Belt states in the US. So it does tie in, the concern that I'm writing about does tie into contemporary, immediate political and social concerns. In terms of the value about writing about things that are more imaginative and speculative, there's two things I would say about that as well. One is just that, I guess I'm writing a genre of philosophy which just kind of fits in with this, like futurism or something. And futurists often have very bad reputation for predicting the future. I've used this quote several times and I've always misattributed it. But there's a famous line that, prediction is hard, especially about the future. And I wanted to kind of avoid making, very firm predictions about what is going to happen with jobs and with human meaning and flourishing in the future. I wanted to instead discuss kind of broad possibilities, scenarios. And I wanted to try and reach out to the limits of what is possible, what is capable or conceivable of being imagined by human beings. I mean, one reason for doing that is to kind of push or push back against maybe an innate tendency to be conservative or to be attached to the status quo, the current status quo in society. That our sense of what is a valuable life, a good life, what is a worthwhile life, might be something that is very parochial and historically contingent. And we get a bit of that when we look to the past, the kinds of lives that people lived in the past and the values that they had in the past seem oftentimes alien or different from the values that we espouse nowadays. And so what will people in 100, 200 years time think of the lives that we now live? Will they think that they were impoverished in some sense? And does it not behoove us to try and project ourselves into their position and see what might be kind of at the outer limits of what is valuable for humanity? And that's one of the things I wanted to do in the book.
Yeah. I want to just confront you now with the first passage that I flagged. It's on page 1, where I read it and I thought, what are you saying? How can that be right? Now, by the end of the chapter, I came around a little bit more to your view, but maybe we can do a version of that live, as it were, for the audience here. So here's the first sentence of your book. Human obsolescence is imminent. We are living through an era in which our activity is becoming less and less relevant to our well-being and to the fate of the planet. This trend toward increased obsolescence is likely to continue in the future, and so we need to prepare ourselves and our societies for this reality. And then ultimately, you'll argue that far from being a cause for despair, this is in fact an opportunity for optimism, and we'll get into all that. But when you read the sentence, our activity is becoming less and less relevant to our own well-being and the fate of the planet, somebody might say, what could you possibly mean by that? You've got climate change that people are very concerned about. Our activity seems to be having wide-reaching consequences for the planet and its fate. So I hope you could address that. And I'll just flag that I gather through reading the rest of this chapter here that you're using obsolescence in a particular sense, almost a technical sense. So maybe you can first just help people understand what is the sense in which our activities could be construed as less relevant to the welfare of the planet and of ourselves. And then how are you using this term obsolescence? What does that mean when you say that that's imminent for our species?
Yeah, look, I mean, that opening paragraph has struck many people who've read the book and many people who've interviewed me about the book as kind of ridiculous or overstated. And I mean, there is an extent to which it is an exercise in kind of rhetorical hyperbole, kind of just to draw people in, to present them with this provocative claim. So, I mean, you mentioned earlier that one of the things you like about some of the work that I do is that I put these provocative theses, and by the end, hopefully people come around to it or think it's slightly less absurd. Yeah, I probably do that a lot, and some people could view it as a gimmick as opposed to, what should
I don't mean to imply that it's a gimmick. So I'm not leading with the presumption that that's how we should interpret this, and I think that the way you do end up spelling out obsolescence is a way that's plausible, even though it's a term that could be interpreted different ways. So yeah, I don't mean to imply that, but I am curious if given that this is how you're opening gamut in the book, how do you respond to those concerns that people raise along those lines?
Yeah, well, like one of the things I say in the paragraph immediately after the one that you just quoted is that claim seems absurd given facts about climate change, given the fact that people often now refer to the era that we're currently living through as the anthropocene, this term that's become part of the popular consciousness and popular debate recently. And it's supposed to capture this notion that humans have never been more relevant or more consequential in terms of their activities and the impact that it's having on the planet and the future of the planet. And obviously that's all true, I think. But I think in what's happening in terms of how our activities are becoming less and less relevant, I think, is that we have now created a kind of techno-social infrastructure combining both our social institutions and our technologies, internet, AI, robotics, and so forth, that is no longer sort of meaningfully within our control, or has become a kind of a Frankenstein's monster in a sense that we have created and that we have less directional guidance over. So that's the kind of sense that I'm trying to capture there in that opening paragraph, the sense that we're becoming less relevant in terms of the guidance and control we have over the future. In terms of obsolescence, you're right that I use that in a slightly technical sense. So some people will conflate it or view it as the same thing as somehow humans are obsolete, we're no longer relevant or useful. And that's not exactly what I mean. What I mean by obsolescence is that we're in the process or state of decline. We're entering a phase when we're becoming less and less relevant to, again, the fate of the planet and the fate of our peers as well. But I mean, I've written another paper which is all about the concept of obsolescence. I wrote it after the book, and one of the things that I explore in that book is different conceptions or senses of obsolescence. And like one thing I will say to qualify the statement I made in the book, or at least add some nuance to it, is that I don't think it's possible for humans to be what I would call generally obsolescent, in the sense that they're not relevant to anything at all. We're always relevant to one another or to our own lives in some sense. There's always some sense of significance or relevance that will apply to humans, but we might be less and less relevant or useful given certain kind of social norms. So for example, this is one of the main theses in the book. If it's the case that our society has been set up in such a way that the only way in which people can make a meaningful or valuable contribution to social life and to build a sense of self-worth is through having paid employment, and if that goes away, then we're obsolescent kind of relative to the ideology or normative structure of the society in which we live. And that's a problem.
Yeah, okay, so I want to turn to that issue of unemployment, technologically induced unemployment as the next question. But maybe just to reflect on what you said, it seems like this Frankenstein's monster analogy that you raised might kind of reconcile the more nuanced interpretation of us becoming obsolete and the seemingly shocking claims. So if humans release a whole bunch of Frankenstein's monsters through technology and other kinds of things that then have the capacity to themselves have a significant effect on the planet in concert with other factors, then there's a sense in which the humans are ultimately responsible for creating this techno-social world that has all these kinds of things, creating the monster that then is outside of their control. But it seems like what you're talking about is the obsolescence has to do with the control, with the sense that you can still directly kind of conduct the way that things play out once it's the case that technology is sufficiently autonomous and sufficiently self-reproducing and so forth. Is that fair?
I mean, like, this is a kind of a long-standing claim in philosophy of technology, and I'm going to forget the name of the author who came up with it, but it's usually referred to kind of as the control problem when it comes to technology. People like Nick Bostrom and his work on superintelligence have maybe popularized this notion to a greater extent. But one thing that people say is that there's a point in time when we do have maybe more control over the technologies that we create. But at that point in time, we're often less aware of the consequences that they will have. And by the time we become aware of the consequences, we often have less control over them. And we're always kind of constantly dancing around that kind of paradox that we don't know enough to know whether we need to control this phenomenon. And then by the time we do know enough, it's too late to do anything about it. And I think we're kind of at that point, and this is one of the arguments that I make in relation to in relation to kind of technological unemployment, that the horse has to some extent already bolted, and a lot of the policy proposals, suggestions that people make to rein it in or slow it down are too late. Somebody actually just mentioned in the chat there, I just saw it popping up on the screen, that the name of that dilemma or paradox is Coleridge's dilemma. Yeah. So thanks, Henrik, for that.
Crowdsourcing the citations for our claims here. Okay, so let's talk about technological unemployment, and I'll use the same gimmick from my perspective here, which is to catch you up in your own language here. So this is from chapter 3. It says why you should hate your job, and here's the sentence: you probably have a job. You may like that job, possibly even love it. It may be the essence of who you are, the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning and gives you a sense of purpose in life. My goal in this chapter is to convince you that you are wrong to feel this way. Even if your job seems good to you right now, you should resent living in a world that requires you to work for a living. To put it bluntly, I will be arguing that work is bad and getting worse, and we should welcome its technological elimination. So, John, you and I are friends. We've talked about our jobs, and we rather like what we do. I mean, I love that I get to wake up in the morning and read and write, and we're very privileged in a certain sense. You know, there's lots of jobs that I probably wouldn't like, and I feel very lucky not to have to work them. But your claim seems to go beyond that, that there's something about doing things that might even seem like part of your identity or might seem to have value to you, but that insofar as you're, as it were, required to do it in exchange for money, there's something about that structure that we should object to. So why should we hate our jobs, to just put it as bluntly as you have in your book?
Yeah, I mean, since you're reading my own words back at me, I feel like I need to now open up my own book and read. Again, the paragraph just after the one you quoted starts with, Let me start with confession. I'm one of those people who loves their job. It is the core of who I am. So in arguing that work is bad, I am arguing against my own day-to-day experience of work. So this makes the argument I'm about to defend a tough sell even to myself. Okay, and then I go on to say it's important to understand the structure and scope of the argument. So what exactly am I arguing when I say that work is a bad thing? Well, like part of this depends on what you define as work, okay? And philosophers love definitional questions, or at least I guess historically in the middle part of the 20th century, they were famous for loving definitional questions, maybe a little bit less so nowadays. But maybe very quickly, like one of the things I argue in the book is that work should not be defined as any kind of particular task or type of activity that humans engage in. Rather, work should be defined as a condition under which activities get performed, namely the condition of kind of like economic reward or economic necessity. So you work in order to achieve an economic reward, a monetary reward typically, or some kind of commodifiable reward that you can exchange on a market or something like that. And for many people, this is necessary in order for them to gain access to or unlock other goods in life. If they don't have the income that they get from their job, they won't have access to these other things that they find desirable. And so that's what I object to, is the need to perform activities under that set of conditions. And so when I'm arguing that work is a bad thing, I'm arguing that we should remove that conditionality from our activities.
So to float back to Andrew Yang, then do you support something like a universal basic income, or we should live in a polity where our basic needs are met automatically, and then the question becomes, what now do we do with ourselves, given that we aren't required to perform these activities in exchange for income in order to be able to meet our basic needs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the prospect of technological unemployment raises two great problems for society. One is what I call the distributional problem, which is the effect that it has on income. And given the fact that we live in cultures or societies in which an income is necessary in order to gain access to the things that make life worthwhile to a large extent. I'm not saying it's necessary for every single thing that makes life worthwhile. And it varies obviously by country, maybe a lot worse in some countries if you don't have a job than it is maybe in the country that I live in, for example, although it's not necessarily great either. But we'll need to address that distributional problem if there's widespread technological unemployment. And there are various suggestions as to how you do that. Basic income is one suggestion. I suspect a combination of proposals is probably needed here, rather than any kind of single silver bullet that will solve everything. Again, provision of basic services and needs to people would also be useful, perhaps as a complement or in addition to a basic income. But yeah, like once we remove that sense of need, that kind of desperation or necessity of having a job in order to unlock these other goods or basic needs and services, what then do we do with our lives, and what can make our lives worthwhile? That's kind of the larger question that's explored in the book, and that's the second challenge of technological unemployment, which is this kind of meaning challenge.
Right. One thing that I appreciate about your book is that you don't adopt this kind of naive futurism where you say, well, let's just welcome our robot overlords and everything's going to be fine, and technology will solve all of our problems. In fact, you have a whole chapter called Giving Techno Pessimism Its Due, where I think you do a fair job of acknowledging that people are maybe rightly concerned about some of the developments in technology. And so I want to ask about one of those concerns, which has been something that a lot of people are talking about, especially now where we're talking about how social media is potentially influencing politics and so forth, which is that if you've seen these documentaries recently, one is called The Social Dilemma, another is called The Great Hack, but they're all making a similar point, which is some people think we got to get away from technology. If only we could get off Twitter and Facebook and all these different things and put our phones away and close our computers and maybe go to a cabin in the woods and read books with paper, then we would really find some kind of human flourishing. And to leap ahead toward the end of the book, you end up talking about something that's in some respects rather different from that, which is maybe we would want to further immerse ourselves in virtual worlds and to embed ourselves within technologies in a way that might be even more pervasive than the way that people are objecting to now. So given that you appreciate the power of the concern, we're partly constituted by our attention. Our attention is being constantly absorbed by these algorithms that are ever more sophisticated in getting us to pay attention to things that maybe we wouldn't reflectively endorse. How do you simultaneously recognize the force of that concern and then end up arguing that mayhaps we should end up spending more time in virtual worlds than we do now?
Right. So I think what you're alluding to there in the chapter that I read about giving techno-pessimism its due is this attentional problem that I discuss. It's one of 5 kind of reasons to be pessimistic about our technological future. So yeah, I think there's two problems with the world that we have currently created or in the process of creating when it comes to attention. One is the sense that our attention is frequently or fragmented. So you have a lot of these services online that are competing for our attention. People often refer to it as the attentional economy. Like the goal is to grab eyeballs, suck people in, get them to return to platforms, constantly refresh their Twitter feed or their Facebook news feed, doom scrolling, as people call it. And I've seen a lot of people talking about doom scrolling today given the election that's happening in the US. That's what they're going to spend their evenings doing. So what's happening is when you have all these services online competing for attention, our capacity to pay attention to things is fragmented and undermined. So we can't actually focus and engage in activities that provide us with a sense of well-being and flourishing. And you know this yourself, you're like a kind of philosopher, psychologist, I guess. I don't know which of those you consider yourself to be more of these days. Doesn't matter, you're transgressing the disciplinary boundaries.
Right. Yeah, no discipline can contain me. I can't answer that question. Yeah. Right, sure.
A mind and intellect too large to be contained by these petty disciplinary boundaries. So, like one of these ideas in psychology, I guess it's a little bit pop psychology. It's something that's filtered into in popular discussions is this notion of flow, and the flow state as being one of the states that's most satisfying and pleasurable for people to be in, where they're this kind of state of sustained concentration on an activity that they find intrinsically rewarding in some sense. And this fragmentation of attention undermines our capacity to do that. And the other thing that I argue is that the kinds of things that we're expected to pay attention to now are the things that aren't necessarily conducive to flourishing. And one simple illustration of this is the sense that one of the things that does seem to grab our attention online, and that is one of the main sources of this competition for attention, is outrage and these hot emotions, anger, fear. These are the things that grab our attention. And if we're constantly doom scrolling, we're not going to be very happy or flourishing, and our sense of well-being will be undermined. And I think that's something that resonates with a lot of people, this combined sense that our capacity to pay attention is fragmented. And I'm sure there's many people watching this or listening to this right now while looking on social media or something like that. And that the things that we're paying attention to are conducive to flourishing. So when I argue later in the book for immersing ourselves in virtual worlds more, and we can discuss what that means if you like, because again, I have maybe a slightly counterintuitive definition of what a virtual world is. You would need to address both of those issues. So the kinds of immersion that we would have in a virtual world would have to be one that sustains engagement and builds on our capacity to kind of engage in these flow type activities. And one of the arguments I have is a certain kind of game-like existence, or playing different games can do that. And it would also then have to be that we aren't paying attention to the kinds of things that undermine or are contrary to our well-being, like outrage and fear and this kind of constant doom scrolling existence that we currently have. Now that's a much tougher problem to solve, because the technological infrastructure that we now created thrives on that, and the kind of economy. That's one of the themes in the documentary, The Social Dilemma, is that we live in this kind of surveillance capitalist economy where the only way to monetize and survive as a company is to promote that kind of engagement or attentional manipulation. So addressing that kind of ideological problem with surveillance capitalism is a much bigger challenge.
Yeah, I think we're going to turn to the Q&A in 3 or 4 minutes. So I'm just going to kind of draw out one more question here. So, one possible response to all this is the disengagement from technology. Let's close our computers and put down our phones and move to the woods and have sustainable farming or something like that. And you propose, as you've just been talking about, a way in which we might find meaning in a world where it's not going to be coming through work. So we're just sort of stipulating here that most of us are going to be technologically unemployed, and the robots are going to be doing most of the things that we formerly found meaning and value in. And you say maybe we can find meaning and value in these virtual worlds. Now, again, you get into a lot of this in great detail, but if I can try to summarize what I imagine a lot of people are thinking when they hear that is, well, there's just something about using our attention to connect up with things that are real, you know, the real world and the soil between our fingers and the smell of trees and so forth. And if we spend a lot of time in these virtual reality worlds, how on earth could that be conducive to our well-being? Because we'd be in some sense dissociated from that which is real. You know, one way this sometimes gets expressed, and you talk about this in the book, is in terms of Nozick's famous thought experiment, which is called the experience machine. So the idea is that people imagine that they're plugged into some kind of virtual reality world.
Like this.
Right. There you go. Yeah. And you know, it feels from the inside as though you're happy, and you're undergoing hedonic states, perhaps that you might like. But many people have the intuition that there's something just structurally wrong with the whole thing because you aren't, as it were, in touch with reality. So we're going to have to do maybe a little bit of metaphysics in a short period of time here to talk about the different sorts of reality that we could be invoking here when we speak this way. And you do talk about that at length in the book. In fact, that was one of the most enjoyable parts of the book, I thought, is what do we mean when we say that something real? You know, it's kind of the bullshitty conversation you have with your roommates at midnight, you know, in college. But there's some very interesting philosophical questions raised by that. So could you talk a little bit about how you would respond to those kinds of objections, that if we spend all this time in virtual reality worlds, there's no way that's going to be ultimately conducive to our flourishing because we won't have maintained our connection with reality?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so as you say, like the stereotypical conception or popular conception of virtual reality is something like this, you know, plugging into a headset and getting absorbed in a computer generated or simulated world. But like one of the things I do in the chapter on virtual worlds is have this lengthy metaphysical discussion of what is reality. It's going to be impossible to condense that into a 2 or 3 minute description or conversation, but I'll try my best. But like one of the main headlines or takeaways from that is that different kinds of objects have different kinds of reality or conditions of reality attached to them. You know, so I mean, let's just give one example. Are we having a real conversation right now, even though we are communicating through digital technology, through representations of one another on the screen? I'm not really physically in a room with you. I'm looking at a 2-dimensional representation of you on my laptop screen. I think we'd say that this is still a real conversation, even though it is heavily mediated through a computer environment. And I think as well, by the way, if we were having a conversation in a VR environment that you get with one of these devices where we're communicating through avatars, not, you know, photorealistic representations of one another, we'd also be having a real conversation. So one of the points that I make in the book is a lot of things that people talk about taking place in computer generated environments or digital environments are in fact real. Okay. But I also argue conversely, a lot of things that happen in the quote unquote real physical world are not real because they involve some kind of fictional representation or projection onto that world. It's a lot of like the social reality that we experience, like the social roles that we ascribe to people, the social statuses that we ascribe to people, marriage, money, things like this. They're not real in any kind of meaningful sense, or they don't have a, let's say,
not in a concrete physical sense. You know,
yeah, not in a concrete physical sense. They are rather like functional kinds, or that they perform a certain function in society. They're social constructions. There's an element of this imaginative projection onto the physical reality that we experience. So that's right. One of the points. And like, so one of the big arguments that I make in the book about virtual worlds is that one of the things that makes a type of existence virtual is that it is, in some sense, contingent or not necessary, that it involves a game-like element. So I go into a very long discussion of what a game is based on the work of another philosopher called Bernard Suits, and he argues that a game is in essence the assumption of some kind of voluntary obstacle in your life, right? So, for example, was one of the illustrations that comes from his book is that suppose you had a robot that could build a house for you. Very simply, or at the click of your fingers, a house could be constructed for you. But despite the fact that you have this technology available to you, you decide, no, I'm going to actually build the house myself. I'm going to source the materials, lay the bricks, lay the foundation, put up the roof. I'm doing it in the wrong order. You can tell I'm not a builder. But that would, what he argues is that would actually be then to turn house building into a game. Because you didn't need to do it. There was a more efficient means of doing it available to you, but you chose the less efficient means because maybe you derived some kind of personal satisfaction from that. And so to kind of bring it all around, you mentioned at the outset, some people talk about, we need this kind of connection to the physical world. We need to retreat to the cabin in the woods, live by the lake, contemplate nature, feel the soil between our fingers on a daily basis. Well, sure, we can do that, and that can be a type of virtual existence. But the reality is, like, that type of existence, that was lauded by these kind of mid 1800s idealist philosophers in the US, or people like Thoreau, that was only possible because they lived a relatively privileged lifestyle where they were freed from many of the necessities of day-to-day living. So
Thoreau was like living in the backyard of Emerson or something, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's also discussions again that he lived pretty close to his, I think his sister and his mother or something, that they did a lot of his cooking and cleaning and things like that. Yeah, so there's a interesting feminist critique of that whole literature as well, and
the self-made man out there, tackling nature by his own resources. So let's look at some of the questions that people are raising here. Stephanie Sullivan has an interesting one, and helpfully it raises a foil to your proposal that you favor. So Stephanie says, do you think humans and technology will merge? Why or why not? Will some humans embrace technology and integrate it into themselves? So it's not us versus them, but us and them. We'll somehow integrate ourselves with technology. Now, you explicitly raised this possibility as one of the ways that things could unfold, and I think you call it a cyborg utopia. So maybe there's some harmony that could be achieved if, rather than having the us versus them that Stephanie alludes to, we could find a way to integrate ourselves with technology and proceed that way. But you ultimately reject this view, so maybe you could both set it up and then knock it down as concisely as you can.
Yeah, so I mean, I do have a kind of lengthy discussion of this possibility of integrating ourselves more with technology. So, one of the claims that's set up in the first half of the book in the discussion of unemployment and automation is that we're in a sense in a race with the machines. Other people have made this argument that they are pushing us out of the domain in which we were previously dominant, and so we face kind of two options. One is to try and fight back and become maybe more like the machines that seem to be replacing us. That's the cyborg or integrationist option, or retreat and do something else, and that's the virtual utopia, virtual worlds option that I ultimately favor. But I will say it's a close run thing. I think that there are some attractions to the cyborg utopia, and I outline, I think, 5 or 6 of them in that chapter. I mean, I noticed retrospectively that the book is all built around like 5s and 6s. So like there's 5 arguments for technological unemployment, and 5 reasons to hate your job, and 5 reasons for pessimism and so forth, techno-pessimism. But in brief, the reason why I'm ultimately not enthusiastic about this integrationist solution, one of the reasons it has to do with the feasibility of it in the short to medium term, that I think we're kind of losing this race against the machines right now. And a lot of the technologies for cyborgization that I see out there are fairly rudimentary. They're not getting us anywhere near where the more speculative posthuman transhumanist desire would like it to be. So that's one point. The other thing as well is that I do suspect that if we followed the cyborg option, we may actually end up just doubling down on many of the worst features of our current economic reality, in the sense that one of the things that I argue is a problem with work in the modern world is that it's increasingly precarious and competitive, and people feel like they have to accumulate, more qualifications, more kind of markers of success or signals of success in order to be employable. People like you and I, academics, it's increasingly the case that they're not getting permanent jobs until they're nearly 40 or something like that. So I think this is an issue that we see in the current work environment. And if one of the things that we also have to compete on when it comes to employment is how extensive our cyborg implants are, we'll just end up kind of exacerbating the worst features of this competitive and increasingly precarious economy. Now, I mean, there's more to the argument than that, and there's other reasons why I think the cyborg solution is a problem, but those are maybe two of the main ones.
So one of the reasons why you don't go all in for the cyborg solution is, as you say, because there are constraints placed by our economic realities that make it technologically not feasible in some ways, and it also may exacerbate problems that exist within our current political and economic realm. And Caroline, somebody or other, has a question that bears on this issue. So Caroline says, well, who owns and controls the technology of the future? How do we express consent or dissent? So I think that's an important point, which is whenever you talk about a utopia, and you raise this point that Karl Popper, who most people I think know as a philosopher of science, also did a fair amount of political philosophy, and argued that we should be wary of any kind of utopian project because it's something where you're going to have one person or group of people's vision of what a good life looks like, and then if we're going to try to get everybody on board with this vision of a better future, often that leads to violence and it leads to the suppression of dissent. And if people say, well, I don't want to plug into your computer, I do want to go live in the cabin by the woods, and why shouldn't I be allowed to? So how do you envision all this happening? The proposal you do favor, how is that going to be consistent with economic and political realities in a way that is better than the cyborg option, which you reject partly on that basis?
Yeah, so I mean, part of this kind of hinges on the vision of what a kind of utopian future would be, and as you say, what Popper is critiquing in his work on this, and other people who critique as well when it comes to utopian projects, is this notion of the utopia as a blueprint for the ideal society that one group, one individual, or one organization within society promotes. And the idea is that we just have to get to that reality. We just have to implement this blueprint and suddenly everything will be wonderful. And the problem with that in practice is that people disagree about the blueprint for the ideal society. You mightn't like the vision of the ideal world that is being promoted by, Antifa or by some other contrary extreme right organization. So, I contrast that with an approach to utopianism which I call the horizontal approach to utopianism. The terminology isn't mine. It comes from a philosopher called Christopher York, where the goal is not so much to implement a blueprint for the ideal future, but rather to maintain a dynamic and open future where we don't try to implement one vision of the good life. We allow many different visions to flourish side by side. Like one of the ideas that I'm attracted to in the book towards the very end is to go back to Robert Nozick, who you mentioned as somebody who'd be critical of this notion of virtual reality, and discuss that problem with the experience machine in the book as well. But one of the things that he did promote in his famous 1974 book on Anarchy, State, and Utopia was the notion of a meta-utopia, which is the notion that instead of trying to implement a blueprint for the ideal society, what we should work towards is some kind of infrastructure where people can build and create and join worlds that are of their own kind of vision of the good life, and that they don't have to feel like they need to impose this vision on somebody else, or that the world in which they live doesn't live up to their preferred vision. So
Can I interject about this? So it might be that somebody doesn't have an explicit blueprint that they're meaning to impose on everyone and to kind of stamp out dissent and so forth. But one point that, feminists and other critics of technology will often raise is that there's often a lot of assumptions that are built into the technology itself that often comes from those who are responsible for producing it. And so, so who are all these computer programmers who are going to be creating the virtual reality in which we exist, and what kinds of values are going to be implicitly baked into the affordances that environment creates for us? And so the background political question here is, how do you make sure that there's enough representation of different sorts of viewpoints and values so that you don't actually short circuit some of this pluralism that you're recommending by, at the level of the people creating the technology, some of those possibilities are already precluded potentially.
Sorry, I don't know what suddenly came over me there. It's probably because you asked a difficult question and I don't know what to say.
Right, yeah, just stalling.
Yeah, stalling for time.
Yeah.
So Yeah, look, it's absolutely correct that technology isn't, value neutral, and it often has a value or ideology built into it, even if it's only implicit, and even if the designers and creators aren't conscious of the ideology that's built into it. It's still usually there in some sense. And look, one of the big challenges or problems for the kind of vision that I promote is that many of us, again, don't actually have the capacity to control and create our own kind of technological future. It's something that is, again, owned and controlled by others. And I don't have like a straightforward solution to the political problem of how we get from where we currently are, which is a world in which that infrastructure is controlled by an elite few, to a world in which it's not controlled by an elite few. But like what I try to do is sketch out the desirability of a world, and why it would be desirable to create a world in which uh, ordinary individuals can have the kind of control over that technological infrastructure, and creating it in a way that isn't just, or kind of personalizing it in a way that isn't just copying the kind of, value system that is implicit amongst the elite at the moment, into their kind of virtual reality. But I mean, in terms of the solving the immediate political problem of like how do you get from there to here, I don't have a solution for that. And that's also not the kind of goal of the book. It isn't to sketch out the political path from where we currently are to where would be more desirable. The goal of the book is rather to figure out what would be desirable.
Right. Okay. So somebody's just asked a question about desirability vis-a-vis the good life, and this person, Walter, says, okay, if you mentioned the good life, are you talking about on the individual level, each of us gets to pursue our own vision of the good life, or do we have to have some sort of sense of what will be good for the community, or how we're all going to pull together to move into this future world? It seems like some of these political questions just are unavoidable, because either you're going to favor a set of technologies that allows each person to craft their own sort of vision of the good life within their virtual reality, or you're going to have technology that's going to be collaborative by its very nature, or that is going to afford the sort of representation that you were just talking about, where ordinary people from different backgrounds with different kinds of power and resources are able to help create this techno political future. So how do you deal with the inevitability of these political constraints on your project? It seems like you can't just bracket them off.
Right. So this is kind of one of the paradoxes at the heart of that kind of like Nozikian view of the meta utopia. I mean, Nozick was famously a libertarian and advocated a minimal state. And the goal is that you have a very minimal constitutional order that allows people to just create and join different kinds of associations that match their own preferences or visions of the good life, or allows them to experiment and join various associations if they don't have a vision of the good life. And one of the things I point out in the book is that there's a problem with Nozick's proposal in the notion that, or the sense that he thinks it will provide justification for this libertarian minimal state. But that seems clearly not true in practice, in that you need to actually have a very maximalist state that will be able to control and police the boundaries between these different associations to prevent one association from trying to invade or colonize or reform another association or mini world. And the same problem would face the kind of vision of the future that I sketched towards the end of the book. So you absolutely can't avoid the kind of political question about about constructing this kind of maximalist constitutional order that will govern the kind of utopian commons, I guess, in my vision. But again, like I don't have the kind of practical solution as to how we create that constitutional order, and how we make it practicable in reality. There are kind of many more detailed proposals out there. Ultimately, I guess what I'm advocating for, in a sense, is a kind of world constitutional order that would be needed to kind of set this up and keep it running. And lots of people have written about the feasibility and difficulty of doing that in practice. But that seems to be the kind of direction that we would need to head. It's not so much a minimal state as it is a kind of maximal state, but one that allows for maximum opportunities for kind of freedom. The other thing, or individual flourishing. But that kind of brings me to the other point that was raised by that question, which is this contrast between individualist vision of the good life and flourishing and communitarian. Well, I mean, my sense would be that I'm not advocating for something that's wholly individualist. I mean, there might be some people who enjoy a wholly individualist life where they can live in the cabin in the woods all by themselves and are self-contained and self-sustaining. But I suspect many more people will want to live in communities, in social groups. That's what they find more nurturing and more life-sustaining. And so it's about creating the opportunities for people to do that. And that's one of the features of this vision of the good life as well.
Right. This might fall into the category of wanting a book to cover more topics than is really within its scope. But Ed Gibney asks an interesting question here, which is whether you have a discussion about non-human animals. I don't recall that you do talk about non-human animals, but let's just reflect on what does all this mean for all the non-humans? You know, we've talked about robots, we've talked about humans, but there's plant life out there, there's all sorts of creatures and so forth. If we're sitting on the couch with our VR goggles on, what happens to, the rest of the roiling life on this planet?
I mean, I'm going to bang on this drum repeatedly that when I argue for a virtual world, I don't argue for people sitting on their couches in VR goggles. Although again, that's maybe one version of it for some people, but it's not the kind of core of the definition of virtual life to me. In terms of what do we do with the non-human animals, I don't have a vision for that or have a discussion of that. I mean, like I've written about kind of debates about moral status of non-humans. Again, I've mainly written about this from the kind of perspective of artificial agents or robots, but I build upon or draw upon arguments lots of people have made in the kind of animal ethics debate. But in terms of what should be done for animals to make their lives more kind of flourishing, worthwhile, I don't have a good answer to that. There are lots of competing views. There are some people like Ben Bramble, as a philosopher, has recently written a paper that we should kill all the predators painlessly in the world because they're living bad lives and are causing a lot of suffering and pain. I don't know if I agree with that, but it's an interesting paper. Certainly, again, an example of this kind of philosophy that starts with a provocative thesis but tries to draw you around to it towards the end. There are other people like David Brin, a science fiction author, who's famously written about the notion of uplifting, that our goal should be to cognitively enhance and uplift animals so that they can experience something like a human type existence or something. I mean, I don't have any view on any of that, but those are just some possibilities that have been discussed by other people.
Yeah. Somebody asks here whether the family structure would be eliminated in this future world. I guess there's a good question about how much of what we're familiar with now would persist and shape what's happening when we're made obsolete in the sense that you discuss in the book, versus how much will we have to reimagine a lot of the basic social organization principles that we currently take for granted. I mean, an example that might be related to this is, well, what happens with, say, reproduction? Already there's interesting papers coming out on just the world of online dating and apps and so forth, which is radically reshaping pretty quickly how people find each other, find potential mates, and so forth. So do you feel like you also have to have your thumb on the pulse of discussions about future modes of reproduction there where, everybody comes out of a test tube in an artificial womb or something like that? Or are you happy to just, leave those conversations to one side and create a proposal that's consistent with a range of possibilities for how families might be constituted?
Yeah, so again, my vision or case for utopia is all about keeping the horizons of possibility opening and not kind of foreclosing anything necessarily, or insisting on, well, we have to get rid of the family as traditionally conceived and we need to deconstruct marriage and marital relationships. Those are kind of possibilities that we should be have on the table, but I wouldn't be prescriptive about them. And I mean, I don't know about reproduction per se, but we have written jointly about issues around relationships and relationship formation. And I think you probably agree with this view anyway, since it was in a paper that we wrote together, which is that there is no one vision of the ideal relationship. And I wouldn't have any prescriptions on you have to have a monogamous pair bond with an opposite sex adult for life. That's one vision of a good or flourishing relationship, but it's not the only one. And it's about keeping the possibilities on the table, I think.
I think this does go back to the idea, as we talked about earlier, that technology isn't value neutral, and it's not just that everything stays the same and then you add some technology on top of it. So one thing that some people are raising about the advent and the spread of these dating apps and so forth is that they don't just create a new environment where we can take all of our diverse potential relationship values and stick it over here into sort of an online world, but rather that the very kinds of affordances that are raised by this technology might incline us toward a different set of values that might actually have structural implications for how all of us relate to one another, and that it's not just as simple as kind of, well, you know, you do your thing and I do my thing. So, I mean, maybe this is just a summary point here, which is that there's going to be the challenge of figuring out how to identify the values that are behind the creation of these technologies in the future, and how to try to, I don't know if you mentioned some sort of constitutional world regime, but it seems like there's something like a need for democratic participation in how we create these technologies. And one criticism a lot of people raise is that the way it's going now is it just isn't like that. You know, it's Elon Musk and all, you know, these white guys who are really good at computer programming, and women have a hard time getting into Silicon Valley and so forth. So I think really paying attention to the political realities that it's very likely that whatever VR capacities exist in the future, unless something changes in our current political environment, is very likely to be shaped by the prejudices and the values of a relatively narrow slice of human beings. So it seems like what's needed then is, you know, political philosophers and people who are concerned about the environment, and, you know, people who advocate on behalf of non-human animals, and feminists and technologists all coming together to the table to kind of be in conversation with the proposals you raise in this book, so that all of these kinds of questions are adequately contextualized.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, there's nothing I can say to that apart from, yeah, that sounds about right, and that's probably a good way of summing it up. But I mean, it's absolutely true that the kinds of affordances in technology can bias you in a particular direction. I mean, again, that's something we've written about jointly in relation to relationships. That, yeah, you know, let's say the kind of apps and services, they get you to fixate on certain features of people or certain attributes of people, as opposed to other things that might be valuable, or they get you to maybe adopt this more transactional mode of relating to other people, as opposed to a more kind of holistic or organic mode of relationships. I think the big problem, and this is something I discuss at greater length in that chapter on techno pessimism, is that an awful lot of the technological infrastructure that we're now creating encourages a kind of like thoughtless, passive engagement with technology, that it's just this thing that is imposed upon us, and we are like your very simple stimulus response machines in relation to it. Somebody tweets something, I click like, you know, I give the appropriate response to it that seems to be conditioned into me by the designers or creators of it. And what we need to move towards is a more kind of thoughtful, autonomous, maybe also collective, plural engagement with technology, where it isn't just this single vision of the technological future. And that's very much, I would hope, a message that is consistent with the argument in the book, which is that, again, it's this horizontal vision of utopian, keeping the possibilities open, the boundaries of human existence open, not closed within a fixed kind of blueprint of what is the good life.
Right. So here's John's book. I think we're in the final, 30 seconds of this thing. So maybe Anthony will hop back on and, oh, feel free to ask one more question. Hey, how about that? We're getting a lifeline here. So I'll pick one about this. I'll pick a question rather from the Q&A. Let's see. Well, let's see. Does anybody have a burning question among the listeners that they want to fling into the Q&A tab here, and then I'll run it by John? Posthuman issues. Okay, John, posthuman issues. Riff on that theme, won't you?
Right. I mean, this is actually something I do discuss a little bit in the book, that like one of the conditions I have on what would be a desirable utopian future is that it must in some sense be relatable to us as we are currently constituted, in the sense that the sort of values that are implemented in it or realized within it have to be ones that are, they don't have to be human per se, but they have to be ones that are recognizable to us in our current state of being. Now, I think that leaves a lot of things on the table, but it does seem to me that like certain kinds of posthuman or transhumanist futures may not be comprehensible to us as we are currently constituted. And like that's one of the criticisms I have of the cyborg utopia, is that if you read a book like Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near, where he has this ultimate vision that we become kind of disembodied intelligence floating through the cosmos, or trying to turn every atom within the cosmos into an intelligent machine of some sort. I think that's roughly the vision that he has. That seems to me to be maybe so kind of far beyond the bounds of what is understandable to us based on the kind of lives that we currently live, that I don't know if we could consider it to be a utopian future, because it's like we just don't even have the map or the guide to understanding that future that we need to
when
have.
people talk about utopia, they mean a utopia for us or for creatures like us. Whereas if you say a utopia in which beings exist that we can't even occupy a perspective that approximates what they might be experiencing, unless you define a utopia as humans are so worthless we just got to get rid of us, and the world would be better off without us. But yeah, if it's a utopia for us, that does place some constraints on the kinds of worlds we can envision here, because the people living in these worlds are going to have certain features that they share with the ones living in the world now.
I mean, I wouldn't be as conservative about it as some people are, in the sense that they think that there is a very kind of narrow vision of what is good for humans, and bioconservatives in debates around human enhancement are of this view. It would be that narrow. But I mean, this kind of relates back to the question that was asked earlier on like non-human animals. So do I have any thoughts on that? Maybe part of the problem here is that just what is utopian for a non-human animal, given that that's such a broad class of beings, is maybe not easily comprehensible to me, or something that I can meaningfully evaluate and discuss. Yeah, I mean, I should also say just one thing, that some people might say the posthuman question means something else, because like posthuman means something else in like humanities, and which like has to do with really rejecting humanism as an ideology or philosophy. If people are interested in that, I did write a recent paper with a guy called Steve Peterson, where I look at a kind of radical sort of post-human future, in a sense, which is called In Defense of the Hive Mind Society, where I look at the desirability of living a Borg-like collective consciousness type existence. So you can find that freely accessible online if you want to read it. That's one of my more kind of distant possibilities.
Yeah, so once again, I'll plug John's blog, Philosophical Disquisitions. It goes along with a podcast where really fun conversations are had. And here's the book. Check it out. I read it. I enjoyed it. And you will too. And thanks for hosting this, Anthony, and the other organizers.